Guys. Hi guys, welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight we're having an open session. I've already got one comment in the description of the event that says, I hope you're available to answer my questions on narrowband. And yes, that's exactly what this is about. We're available to answer your questions on basically anything. But as I'm waiting to fill up the room, and we neglected to do a image of the week this week. So what I'm going to do is on the fly, I'm just coming up with this now. On the fly, I'm going to actually pull up one of the great images that I saw this week. And bear with me because I have to go into Cloudy Nights to pull it up. But you're gonna see where I'm going with this, because this week is Okie-Tex. And oh my goodness, I'm not even logged into Cloudy Nights. How did that happen? This week is Okie-Tex, and Josh is at Okie-Tex, and he's doing another collaboration with his father, and it's a good one. He posted a few variations of this on AstroBin, so let me pull up. Sorry for the delay. I'm waiting for this to pop in, but maybe after the fact, I'll post this as the image of the week just so we could see it. Screen share. And there you go. I think you're seeing the whole screen. Let me know if you can't see the image. I think you can see it. I don't think maybe scanning down helps a little bit, but I'm not sure. So this is LBN 552, and Josh has taken this from Okie-Tex. Really cool reflection nebula and dark dust. And I'm sure next week Josh will be on, and we're going to have to ask him about this one. I'm sure he's going to be glad to share because, well, I don't know about you, but I want to know about what goes on at Okie-Tex and all these star parties, and hopefully make it down there. In the meantime, I don't know. It's getting colder outside up here, so the opportunity to go south to do some shooting might be tempting. But yeah, that's Josh's image, and let's see if I got my camera back by closing that. Nope, I didn't. There we go, got my camera back, and yeah. So I see there's some people in the room. I am going to open up chat. Remember, guys, we have chat. That is where you are going to post your questions, and we'll answer them. But before I jump into that, what do I have today? I'm going to bring up something we were just chatting about. I really wish Josh was in the room for this, because we we've all, I'm going to say we've all probably made this mistake. And I remember when we had Warren Keller on, he mentioned he was a little confused by something we said, and I think he reiterated a bit in his book. But I just picked up, it's probably backwards to you, or at least looks backwards to me, Inside PixInsight, which is Warren's new book on PixInsight. And as I was reading through, one of the things that stood out to me was in his star removal section, he said, Grant is way ahead of me. He had mentioned star removal and tone mapping, and he said, in fewer words, tone mapping isn't really the proper way to refer to star removal. And I've always thought that myself. I'm not sure how you get star removal from tone mapping. David Alt was just saying tone mapping tends to relate to how you apply different color channels to your image, or color channels to the luminance, or in fewer words, mapping the tones. But somehow, and we did look back, and I know JP Mezzoviano refers to star removal as tone mapping. And I know that we've all picked up that moniker and referred to star removal as tone mapping. But maybe we're kind of wrong here. Maybe Warren's right about that, because how are we mapping tones? But yeah, that was the discussion that popped up at 3 minutes before we went live, and we were all kind of trying to figure out what we're referring to. But Grant, on that same question, he'd like to hear about tone mapping. Curious as to which image you pull the stars from, and if you use PS content aware, as was mentioned on Cloudy Nights today. Okay, so when you say you're curious as to which image you pull the stars from, I'm guessing that that is for, well, I could read that two different ways. It's either do you remove the stars from the RGB image, or do you remove it channel at a time? Or whether you're asking which stars you pull the stars from to put them back into the image.
I think, Adam, and this was talked about in one of Josh's videos, I think, at one point, that you can take the stars out of, say, a narrowband composition and put in the RGB stars, right,
Okay.
from a different set of filters or something like that, right?
Do you pull from the luminance file? And yes. So if you're doing, okay, so I think the answer is it depends. And I'm going to speak for Josh here, because Josh's technique actually enables him to push the dust, the dimmer dust, a bit further. Josh removes it, I believe, from the individual channels, the individual monochromatic channels, and after doing so, stretches the dust further. When I tend to do star removal, I don't do it from my individual channels, because I actually, the way I kind of do it, what I feel more comfortable doing, I don't really do it so that I can push the channels much further. I just kind of do it because I want to see what it looks like with only the dust in there. So I end up pulling it straight out of my RGB image, which probably makes it a bit more difficult to clean up the stars completely. But in the past few times I've done it, it was for animating images and that type of thing. But so, for example, Josh, I think, would, excuse me, remove it from each individual channel, the O3, or the HL for the S2, or if he was doing RGB, he would probably pull it from the luminance. And my guess, and I may be wrong here, is he would probably replace it with stars from only the RGB image, because you may not need that much brightness in the stars. Wow, I'd really want to ask Josh, though, what his specific technique is, because I know he uses it all the time on basically every image, and I use it much more infrequently, basically when I just want to get a specific look out of a specific image.
Yeah, he and Eric uses it a lot as well. I can't say that I use it much either.
Maybe, I know Eric keeps popping in and out, so I'm not sure if Eric is having troubles, or if he just is having a party at his house. But if he does pop back in, we can ask him about that.
I think maybe the reason why it's called tone mapping is because what you do after you remove the stars is because you play with colors. This way you don't have to worry about the star colors once you remove. Maybe that's the reason why. But you're right, it really doesn't make sense why it doesn't add up.
But the name tone mapping, came into really big use when we started doing HDR images. So tone mapping was an intensity transform technique to deal with large dynamic range compressed into an 8-bit image. But technically we're doing tone mapping all the time. All of our data is 14-bit, 16-bit information compressed. So technically what we're doing when we are stretching the image, that is tone mapping of a sort, right? It doesn't have to be colors. It can be intensities that are being mapped to different intensities.
Right.
Can one tone map without removing the stars?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, Alex,
There's two different operations. One is removing the stars, and the other is tone mapping. And we just somehow got sloppy with the language and just started calling it tone mapping.
Yeah, like we were talking about, I don't know where the term came from in regards to removing the stars and separating them and then doing additional stretching, right? But the point is to get the stars out so that you can stretch the data further, the nebulous information or things like that, and get more out of your image that way. Stars are always difficult to handle Right. They're essentially point source objects, and so they tend to bloat and cause other issues when you want to really aggressively stretch other information.
And on to the other part of Grant's question. Do I use, or does anyone use Photoshop's content aware? And I don't think you'd really need to use content aware filters for really any sort of star removal, because the clone stamp, basically, when you're at the point where you're just using those filters, you've probably got an image that you've used dust and scratches on. So basically, it's just the residue of the large stars, I guess you'd say, that's in there. So it'd kind of be like overkill to use content aware, because the clone stamp works fine. And I'll tell you, I've used content aware in some really cool terrestrial photos. If you're taking a picture of a building and there's a big column in the way, you can literally take the column out and clean it up and make it look like the column was never there. Or if you're taking a picture of a room and there's something's, I don't know, there's a person in front of it, you can take the person out really easily. But for what we do, I think it's kind of overkill. And in some cases, it can get kind of funky because of the kind of overkill of it. It's doing a lot of processing to replicate the scene, and we basically just have, particularly when you're removing the stars, just have slight little brightnesses we're trying to correct. And you guys probably see Ed Thompson's questions. That he has a Celestron 6 SE, would like to record a video of the sun with the ZWO planetary imager, but the field of view, the sun, is too large. Celestron 6 SE with, yeah, I don't think you're going to be able to do anything. A focal reducer won't get it down to small enough where you're going to get a single frame of it. So what you might end up having to do is mosaic it. Take a bunch of photos across the sun and then create a mosaic. Now, I'm assuming you are using a white light filter. You must be using a white light filter on the S6 SE. If you have a wide field refractor, you might be able to use that and get the sun in the full frame.
You know, there is a focal reducer that you can buy for $35 that allows you to get what's it, half. It doubles your field of view. I bought mine from OPT. Now, whether the 6SE has too much focal length to make it work or not, I don't know. I went looking for my Astroaid phone to find out what it had to say about the issue. Kind of put it in there, but I couldn't find my phone. So
a common problem with those really aggressive reducers is field curvature. But depending on which ZWO planetary imager he has, the sensor may be so small it doesn't matter.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. And
I was just going to say,
when you say
Sorry,
the field
go
of view is too small, what you're saying is that the sun more than fills the image, the chip. And I had that problem on my TV85 trying to image on my DMK, whatever it was. And I was cured for $35 and cured very nicely. But you're going to want even more than that if you're taking pictures of the eclipse. During the eclipse itself, during the preliminary stages leading up to the eclipse, sure, you can go ahead and, as long as you've got just a touch more than a ½ degree field of view, that is the size of the sun, you can get it. But that's not what you want to do when you're taking pictures of the eclipse. You want 4 or so degrees worth of field of view, because you're not taking a picture of the sun anymore. You're taking a picture of the corona of the sun, which could extend for some distance, and you want to have some other sky on either side of it. So What are you, is there a reason you're attached to the 6SE? I don't know what the focal length on it is, but it doesn't sound good. It sounds like it's going to have too much focal length.
Yeah, usually with those planetary Zoe cameras, perhaps the 120, you need like a 60 or maybe smaller refractor to get the whole disc in.
I'm thinking camera lens.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. The sun is
300 millimeter. 300 millimeter might do it.
Might. I'm trying to, I had my Zenith Star 66 with my Chameleon. So it's another small chip. I'm not sure exactly how they compare, but even with the 0.5 reducer, I could barely get the full sun in the field of view. So that's how you're using an SCT. So that's how I'm inclined to say you have way too much focal length. You need to be somewhere 300 or below to potentially fit it into the field of view.
I can tell you that the 290 ASI 290 that I have will fit the moon or sun at about 300 millimeter focal length. Less than that, and you're going to start cropping.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I'm looking it up on my, I found my phone. So I'll look it up, see what we can get.
Great. Jeffrey Geis is asking, what is a good way to grade the subs before they are stacked? And I'm going to ask a quick follow-up. What processing program are you using, Jeffrey? Because I would say that David has the best method, not only for grading the subs, but also for applying that grading to the stacking program so that you weigh the subs appropriately so you actually get the most out of the images. But his method's in PixInsight. So if you were using Deep Sky Stacker, then it gets a little bit, then the solution would be a little bit different.
He said PixInsight. So actually, you know, I described my subframe selector process, I think, on one of my tutorials, but I actually talked to Warren about this, and the process he uses in his book is actually very similar to that as well. And he references the spreadsheet that I set up for doing some of the evaluation, determining the equations you want to use. If you want us to go into a little more detail, we can do that, Jeffrey. But
I would, Jeff, I would suggest, David, do you remember the title of that video? That
no, I don't. I can find it though, so we can get back to it.
Yeah, honestly, you should watch that because you'll need, basically all you really need is the equation that he puts into subframe selector, and then it shows you how to apply the weights to, he uses specific keywords that apply the weights in image integration. But that video, I mean, alone, that made my images better just because you realize how scrutinizing and then weighing, which takes you a step further, really does improve your final caliber, your final stacks.
David, on the same note, I have a question about that.
Sure.
Does the FFS weights used in Drizzle integration?
Absolutely. There's actually a checkbox on Drizzle integration for using weights, and it will use whatever is coded into the original files that gets put into the.
Okay.
Drizzle goes back to the original source file before registration, right? So it picks up all the information from there.
Okay. But do you have to use the regular integration first?
You always have to use the regular integration first to do Drizzle integration.
Okay.
It codes all the information for rejection and everything.
So that's how it gets in
files.
I got it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Bill K is saying, how about stop down the aperture? I'm assuming that he's referring to Ed's question in regards to the eclipse, but remember, stopping down the aperture doesn't change the field of view, it only makes it slower. So if your image is too bright, then it may fix your issue. But if your issue is that you have too much focal length, then No, it doesn't change your focal length. Warren, yeah, I know many people have discussed the tone mapping that JP Metziviano describes in his tutorial where he removes the stars. And yeah, that's exactly what we're referring to. Really, really cool technique. His website's great. I think he was the first person that I saw using the technique. And he uses it really well. And he uses it in a lot of different ways, whether it's for creating the animations or just to display them without stars. But yeah, it's a great resource just to look at that.
I looked up, you got 1500 on a 6SE, you've got 1500 millimeters worth of focal length, and you've just got too much focal length to try to catch the full field of the sun on a small planetary imager. It's just not going to go. And I see the comments are continuing here about that. I don't think the focal reducer that I suggested will do what you want it to do. What you might get by with, it's kind of small and it is a one-armed mount, so it may not be able to handle it. But if you can put a camera up on top of the, just piggyback it with a regular lens, you're probably going to get, that's probably going to be as good as you can get. On the other hand, you may have to ask yourself the question, why do you have a driven mount at all? What are you trying to take a picture of? If you're trying to take a picture of the partial phases, it's nice to have a driven mount that kind of follows them along. But during showtime, during that 2.5 minutes during the total eclipse, it's not going to be moving all that far anyway. And unless you've got lots of experience, I think you've heard that admonition we made here several times. Don't worry about taking pictures of this thing. You know, go look at the dang thing. There'll be other people taking better pictures than you or I could take. So, okay, sorry to come back to that after we seem to have moved on, but.
No problem. I did just post in chat the video that we think David did the tutorial on subframe selector in. And this is the one where he goes into weighing and, well, basically using subframe selector to analyze and weigh the images. And there's a few extra steps in that, so it's a good one to read, to watch, just so you can make your way through it.
And for those of you who've gotten your copy of Warren's book, you'll notice that David gets a shout out for quoting his spreadsheet in there. So he's quoted.
Lakeisha, no dumb questions here. How do you align your mount if you're using just a DSLR on an Orion mount? Now, I have to admit, I'm not so familiar with Orion mounts, but I'm going to make a quick assumption here that you at least need one star. Well, you roughly polar align, and then you tell it where at least one star is, and someone could correct me if I'm wrong about that with the Orion. But with the DSLR, you're only going to be able to see one of maybe the 10 brightest stars out there. So you have to pick from bright stars. And if it's anything like my Celestron mount, then you would put the DSLR on the mount in the dovetail, however it's going to be, and point it roughly towards the bright star. Then bring up your acquisition program until you can see the bright star on the screen, whether it's on the back of the camera or on your laptop screen. And if you can't see it, you probably have to work on your focus. Get it focused enough so that you can see it. And if you're using a lens, then most likely just roughly pointing it at that star will get it close enough so that it's in the field. And when it's in the field, then you can use the fine controls or the hand control to get it centered. If it's on the back of your camera, you might have to use the grid box or the crosshair box. I don't know. Is there a crosshair box on DSLRs? I don't even remember. Because basically I use my laptop, and my acquisition program has crosshairs, and I just make sure that I get it right into the center there, and when it's centered, then I click on my mount sync. I don't know if on the Orion it's align or with the Celestron mounts. I think it was also called Sync, and with those using using the specific alignment process, I think you wanted 3 stars.
Could I say something about that? A couple of things. Well, in a comment a little bit later over on the YouTube thread, it says that it specifies what kind of Orion mount you're using, and there's very good chance that you've got a polar alignment scope in there. Now, that's probably pretty good. That's probably all you need, because the other part of this is if all you're using is a DSLR somehow mounted to the top of that, or are you putting a DSLR on the back of a telescope? If you're putting a DSLR on the back of a telescope, well, then what I'm about to say isn't going to go very well. But if you're just somehow putting a DSLR sit with a camera lens on top of your Orion mount, then you really don't have to worry about it all that much. Your polar alignment scope will probably get you so close that in the 30 seconds or minute long exposures that you're taking, you're not going to have too much of a problem with polar alignment. As far as location alignment, meaning where your telescope is actually pointing when you do a go-to, you're going to have a little bit of a problem, because simply seeing things through a DSLR finder, visual finder, or using live view is just tough. You got to use the real bright stars, and then they'll show up, but otherwise they won't. So then you're going to get into a computer program, and once you start hooking a computer to it, then there's all sorts of other things going on. It sounds like you're trying to put a DSLR camera on top of an Orion mount, and you probably don't have to be all that critical, because you don't have that much focal length going, and you're not going to be taking very long exposures with it anyway. So I would suggest give it a try, and you'll probably work out something with a little experimentation.
Yeah, it's funny because there are different techniques that everyone uses to both align and polar align. And if you're referring to polar aligning, I agree with Alex, where it's, unless you're doing something really funny, unless you're trying to take 10-minute exposures with that DSLR, polar alignment probably isn't that critical. On the other hand,
and for star alignment, I would suggest to use an eyepiece first. You know, do your 1-star, 2-star alignment, then take it out and put the camera in. This way you could actually go to a bright star and focus the camera. Because doing it straight off the camera, you're not even going to know if you're in focus to do even polar alignment. So you're better off using an eyepiece first.
But we don't know if Lakeisha is actually using a telescope. She might only have the DSLR. Like,
type something in. And by the way, somebody's mentioned that, hey, if you've got the full setup up there and you're actually working with the computer and everything, you could use plate solving.
Mm-hmm. Which is what my complex brain goes to. I say, oh, well, you can plate solve, and you know you're pointing at the right spot. But at the same time, I'd be using the DSLR and some sort of the back and forth curve to, or the back and forth method. What is it? The V method, where you converge the V to polar align, which may not be necessary. It just kind of depends on what your plan is for the night. Oh yeah, and EQ mod has its own polar alignment routine.
I think she's using the DSLR with a camera lens, because she just said that she's thinking about an Ioptron Sky Tracker.
Okay, with an Ioptron Sky Tracker, you're going to be looking through the viewfinder, you know, through a camera lens, etc. And how you align it is you go look for a bright star as well as you can, but because you're using a camera lens, you don't really have to fuss it all that much. If what I would do is take a look through the viewfinder and see if you can see let's say you wanted to take a picture of the central summer Milky Way, and, or let's say of Lyra up to Cygnus. Well, you can pretty well tell that your camera's pointed that way. and your field of view is something like 60 degrees or 50 degrees, depending on what kind of a lens you're using on that. If you're using a 200 millimeter, it'll be significantly less than that, but you can pretty well tell you're pointed that way. And that's about all the real fancy alignment you have to do. Also with the Ioptron, you do have a polar alignment scope in it that is probably quite adequate, because remember, you're only taking relatively short exposures and you've got a big field of view, and those are things that just kind of hide little mistakes.
Yeah, and I'm sure you could push an Ioptron Sky Tracker to its limits. I wouldn't expect to have luck if you put a 400 millimeter lens on there, but with a 50 millimeter or 100 millimeter, you could probably have a lot of fun. And as Alex says, not worry about exact pointing, because you've got a wide enough field that you basically know you're pointing there.
Okay, and here's one more suggestion, just to belabor the point. Take a 10-second exposure and see if you like the way it's pointed. In a 10-second exposure at 3200 ISO or 6400, whatever your highest ISO is, you can actually see the picture. And it may be a poopy, noisy picture because it's taken at a high ISO and there's not enough exposure time on it, but at least you can figure out where your camera's pointing. Then when you got your camera pointing to the right place, then you're set up. The one little problem with that is that once you start adjusting, it's real hard to adjust those things to just where you want them, because you can't really see just exactly where you're adjusting them. So take a look at the one bright star that you've got, and if it's up too high in the picture, move it down. Don't worry about the nebula that happens to be right next to it, which is what you really want to take a picture of. Worry about that bright star. 300 is too much. I think that once you get, Lakeisha asks, Lakeisha, once you get good at pointing your Ioptron or any other device mount that you're talking about, no, 300, it can probably handle a 30-second exposure at 300 focal length, okay? But you're going to have to be getting pretty good at that. You're going to have everything stable, good solid tripod, solid connections in your camera and everything else like that. But I have seen pictures at 300 with those little trackers.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing, Alex. I know someone who's been using an Ioptron Sky Tracker, and he's actually taken it to 600 millimeter focal length and done reasonably well. But that's really, really pushing it. And if you zoom in on, as a 1-to-1 scale on the image, it's, it really degrades quickly. The stars are not round and things like this. But, for a wide field shot, you're not really zooming in most of the time, right? It's displayed on a smaller screen and things like this. So, they're workable. But 300 millimeters, I wouldn't really recommend going past that for someone who's just starting out with one.
But the important thing is, as soon as this program is over, take it outside, put it on your tripod, and practice, practice, practice.
Yeah, like anything else, you're going to take your first few shots, even with the 300 millimeter lens, and even if the stars are elongated, and you put it up in front of our noses for critical viewing, and we're going to tear it apart, you might be really happy with it. But we're kind of crazy here, and we are very particular about our images, and we're very critical of our own images. So
Speak for yourself, speak for yourself, speak for yourself.
well,
Some of us are.
some of us are, but
Others
I guess
of us can't afford to be.
I guess my point is, you can have a lot of fun with an Ioptron Sky Tracker taking images. If you are having issues with it, then at 300 millimeters, then you might start to say, well, it could be that I'm getting better and it's the limitation of my equipment, as opposed to I'm doing something wrong. And, well, I guess that's the point. If you have any further questions on that, please keep asking them. I'm going to move on to Drew's question, but I'll get back to your question if I see other things pop up. Drew, can someone explain if there's any value on going to a side-by-side dovetail system for a fairly light load, 120 millimeter and a 66 millimeter refractor, as opposed to piggybacking? And I'm going to say I have seen more issues with side-by-side setups than anything else. I think they just invite flexure, particularly if you are using a larger scope on one side and a smaller scope on the other. You just cannot get them as rigid as you would first an OAG setup, which is the ultimate in not having to worry about flexure, but secondary in a piggyback setup. Ultimately, the best piggyback setup would be super rigid rings mounted on top of, with rings mounted to it, so there's no opportunity for flexure. And that's the way that the AP, the astrophysics guys do their piggyback guiding. The more common way that people do piggyback guiding with the guide scope is with the 3-point rings that the Delrin tipped 3-point rings. And I will say it's common, but from experience, it's also a little bit frustrating. I just don't think those rings hold it tight enough to allow you to go as far as you may want with exposures. Now, I didn't discover this until I started going above 5 to 8 minute exposures. So I would do 5-minute exposures, they were perfect. I would do 8-minute exposures and they'd have elongation, and nothing I could do could fix that. My solution was to go to an off-axis guider. So once I took flexure out of the equation, half-hour exposures, no problem. 1-hour exposures, no problem. My opinion is side-by-side dovetails are asking for troubles unless you are doing something creative. If you're planning on guiding through one and imaging through the other, I think it's just asking for trouble, though.
I want to say a couple of things. One is that when you go top and bottom, you are inherently putting more of a load on your mount because the weights are further away from the fulcrum points, the pivot points of your right ascension drive. So remember that everything's further. Since it's further away from that point, you have to put more weight on the other end of the counterweight bar to keep it balanced. Secondly, if you are going to go with a side-by-side, and even if you aren't going by a side-by-side, an awful lot of people forget that you can't balance your telescope. Well, I'm talking a German equatorial mount here. You can't balance your telescope the way they say in the tutorials. Everybody knows you put your counterweight bar level with the tube at one end and you loosen up your declination, and you watch to see whether the front of the scope or the back of the scope goes down, and you balance it out so that it goes neither up nor down. So that's part one. Part two is to tighten back up on that deck and loosen the RA and see if the counterweights pull down or if the tube itself pulls down, and you move the counterweights back and forth until it's equal. Well, realize that if you've got that piggyback up there, you're going to have those counterweights further away, which has some implications in itself. But what you don't realize, what a lot of people don't realize, that there is a third place that you should be doing things. Counterweight bar still even, and this time take your deck and loosen it up and point your tube straight into the ground, and then see whether the tube itself rotates around the declination, because it's possible to have a third place for it to be out of balance. That you don't realize it, but it really starts showing up when you have side-by-side mounts, and it can even show up if you have your guide scope off axis or your camera off axis. I've seen more than a few people mount on a Newtonian tube on a German equatorial mount, and their camera is sticking off the side of the mount, which inherently unbalances the mount. Your camera should be in the same axis as the right ascension gearing and stuff like that is. So everything's all the same. It should be under the tube, not coming off the side of the tube. So just balance that third area. There may be a reason for you to go with the side-by-side. You got more room to mess with things if you're going side-by-side, I think. But I agree more along the lines of what Adam said earlier. Okay, so if you are going side by side, be sure to balance in that third dimension.
Yeah, I'd say it's trickier to do side by side, like because of Alex's point about the balancing. But it's also flexure's an issue. But if you can make a rigid system and you can deal with your balance issues, it can be a good setup, and it does work around some issues like with a ring system, stacked top to bottom, then you're putting pressure on the rings and stuff like that, and that can cause other issues. And so none of them are always just a win-win. It just depends on the actual setup.
I think if I don't know if you guys remember Charles Bracken's presentation. He was using double star 71s. Two identical systems. That may not be that bad. Trying to balance the deck on that third dimension Alex is talking about. But if you have two, like a 120 and a 60, I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, it can be done. And W. Sprang or W.S. Sprang, whoever, says, I like the side-by-side for my solar shots. He puts white on one and hydrogen alpha in the other. Yeah, but that's a different beast than doing deep space photography where you're trying to track very tightly. Because you're using the video and lots and lots of frames, you can have motion. You can have things moving around, and it's not quite as critical.
Yeah, for solar, it's really cool.
But I agree with you, and I know lots of people who do that.
Yeah, some comments on someone who owns a Sky Tracker and said they have just disappeared on me.
I get 6 out of 10 subs.
Yeah, with perfect stars.
Perfect star shooting with heavy.
1 out of every 6 to 10 subs with perfect stars with a heavy 300 millimeter and a Canon 5D. Crop sensor and a 75 to 300 works a little bit better. Yeah, because the 300 millimeter prime lens is probably a much bigger lens than the zoom, I'm going to guess. Because I think it's an f2.8, right? Something like that. Maybe it's an f4. But either way, Winston, how do we choose our targets? You feel like you've imaged a good percentage of targets at 65 millimeters, but there's more out there. I don't have a great way of selecting my targets. I tend to, I do always peek back at my AstroBin bookmarks, and I see what shots that I bookmarked that I say, hey, I've got to try that. And I tend to mostly bookmark the stuff that when I'm browsing AstroBin, I look at the star map and I see whether I can actually see it in my sky. And if it's something I can see in my sky, then I bookmark it. But Alex is showing off
Deep Space Image Catalog by Roger Blake, and it's got an awkward little thing when you're trying to hold your camera and your desktop and all that other stuff. And for some reason, Windows just displayed a whole bunch of stuff. Okay, there we go. Is that right side up or upside down?
Upside down.
Are you dizzy, Wizzy? I know it's backwards. Okay. It's got page after page after page after page, etc. It's got 82,000 pictures. I doubt that, but I needed a number real quick, and that came to mind. And the thing about them is that they're organized according to the time of the year. So according to the 13-hour objects. Let's see. Last night I was down in the 22, 23-hour list. So a 22-hour list, I can tell. Can I tell that, or am I making you dizzy? I can tell that on. Let me get back a little ways. There we go. On October 1st, these objects were going to be transiting at about 10 o'clock at night. And so I can thumb through here and pick which objects I may want to take pictures of that night, whether I've got a 1-degree field of view or a half-degree field of view. Like the helix would have been a good image from last night. And like I said, for 39 bucks, there are other ways to do this, no doubt. But this is just so convenient, thumbing through the book and looking for things that you've taken or not taken yet. Okay? So that's how I do it.
Very cool. And
I mentioned one in the chat. So one I commonly use is tsobrowser.com. It's pretty nice. It allows you to filter, by field of view, surface brightness. You can kind of narrow things in. Whether it's a galaxy or diffuse nebula or things like that. It's a nice resource for doing things like that. Another one that I've been trying to use but haven't really got to is SkyTools 3. I know a lot of people that are using that, and they're really liking it. It allows you to be very detailed about your setup, what your light pollution levels are like, and what kind of signal to noise ratio you might expect, and things like this. And I just haven't really got that far into it to determine whether it's useful for me or not yet.
And Lakeisha was asking the name of Alex's book, and it's Deep Space Image Catalog, correct?
Deep Space Image Catalog
By
and Roger Blake, B-L-A-K-E.
Charles,
It's got a lot more stuff in it, but that's the part that is really of value to me.
Yep. Charles Bracken also has what is it? The Deep Sky Atlas.
101 images or something like that. Oh boy, it's a very popular book. 101 astrophotography targets. What's that one? A lot of people swear by that.
Yeah, I have that book.
Okay, what's it called? What's the real name and the author?
Here, let me go get it, then I can show.
Okay. Meanwhile, David has asked why straight down, as that will never be a position the telescope would actually be oriented in. And I hope you guys are all following along. I'm not sure I'm following along in this particular discussion today.
We're jumping around a bit, yeah.
We're jumping around a little bit. It's very awkward the way these comments are coming up the side. But at any rate, remember, you're on a Newtonian, the image is coming out the side of the tube. So your camera is going to be pointed 90 degrees away from the optical axis of the primary. Okay, because it's coming. Okay, there's Tolga. See, Tolga's got 100 best astrophotography targets by Ruben Kier. And that's very popular. Can you flip a few pages there without getting dizzy as I got everybody? Okay. He tends to spend a paragraph or two, or no, a whole page or two describing the image.
Each flip page, a description, and the picture on one side.
Okay, yeah. So they're prettier pictures than Roger Blake is using, but there aren't nearly as many of them. And when I say 83 million or whatever number I gave you, you get all 110 Messiers, 109 Caldwells, 110 SAC, TAAS, RASC, all 110 of them, 200 plus Herschel, plus 90 new objects. I don't know new from where, but the index alone goes on for 10 or 15 pages. So, okay, back to why.
This is categorized. I'm sorry. This is categorized by month. Like if you see, it'll say January, and here's the list of the targets in January.
And then after that, what you want to do is you want to get out your whatever program you use to tell when things are coming up. And you're going to want to get something that's coming up. It's going to be about 30 degrees above the horizon when your imaging session starts. And, just pick an object that's appropriate to your focal length, appropriate to your camera sensor, appropriate to all the things we talked about a year and a half ago in an astroimaging channel session on just this topic, how to pick your targets. Okay, so if you go back when we used to have an index, I think you'll find a reference to that someplace, and we do have a show on that. Back to why you put your focusers so that it's pointed down.
first off, when I define down, I mean rotate your tube such that the focuser is on the bottom when you are in the home position, you know, pointing north, counterweight down. Counterweight down in a German equatorial mount, pointing north, okay? And then put your camera so that it is on the bottom side of that mount. And it's, of course, pointing into the on the bottom side of the tube. It's, of course, pointing into the secondary, which is up above it. And so, yeah, there's plenty of times when your camera, when your telescope tube will be pointing, no matter where your telescope tube will be pointing, it'll be moving around. But that's the place where it will always be in line with the counterweight bar, with anything you put up on top, with anything you put down below, so that everything's all in the same line. And because it's all in the same line, your balances aren't changing depending on the position of your tube. That's all I meant to say. There will be times now, if you were to move that same tube away from pointing north, you know, swing it 90 degrees towards one horizon or the other, and yeah, it's no longer on the side. It'll never be on top, but it's no longer on the side, but it's still in line with the counterweight bar. Okay, that's where you put your camera on the typical Newtonian. Okay, David?
Question from Kuyaik. Can you combine data from two different cameras, DSLR and mono CD, same scope but different image scales? Of course. There are some, I will say, quirks of doing it. You have to know what your goal is out of doing it. Are you using the mono CCD to get the luminance and then using the DSLR to bring in the color channels for it? Do you just have good DSLR data that you want to combine with your mono CCD data? And depending on your goal out of it, there's a few different techniques. I think that Josh and I covered a little bit of this in our image collaboration presentation. We both collaborated on an image, but we were both using mono CCDs, and the way it ended up working was his data was a little bit better than mine, but we didn't want to completely ignore mine, so we ended up using some of David Alt's weighing magic in PixInsight to help us weigh the subs. I think that because of the scale differences, PixInsight wanted to treat my subs as if they were better quality than Josh's subs, even though visibly we thought that that wasn't the case, or knew that that wasn't the case. So we, I don't even remember how we did weigh them, but
yeah, the algorithms don't do very well if you have different scale differences. It doesn't do a good job of determining the noise in one versus the other that way.
yeah, what did we do? Did we register them all on the same scale and then weigh them? I think that's what we did, but I'm forgetting. I think we registered them all on one to get the basically the scales to be the same, and then we went through the process. I'll look it up, but it is in that presentation, Image Collaborations, and I think you'll get a lot out of there if you need to, if you want to figure out how to do it.
Yeah, there's other things. There's other things to pay attention to when you're combining data, especially if there's a wide disparity in image scale or resolution, right? Because you can end up with, you know, weird halos and stuff like this when you combine the data where it partially thinks things should be rejected even though they really shouldn't be, and so you do have to be a little bit careful on how you combine things. But you know, in general, it works pretty well. You know, you just have to be a little careful about how you do it.
And don't limit yourself to just your own pictures. You can go on the Hubble website, download some stuff they've done, and mix it in with your stuff.
They really like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey data, right? That's fantastic for playing around with and learning, and you know, just having a good time, seeing what you get out of it.
Add color to some of those old Palomar shots.
Absolutely.
For Tolga or other 1600 mono users, should I be looking at moving out of my Attic 460 in favor of the 1600 since he images in a red zone LP area? He's seen that they handle light pollution well. Is the 460 always one-shot color? I'm just not.
That's. I actually saw that question. I asked that question on the chat. Yeah, if it's a one-shot color, monochrome is always going to be better in a light pollution environment. But 460 is a very good Sony sensor, so I don't know if you're going to improve by going to a 1600.
Yeah, if it's the mono sensor, I would almost expect the 460 to possibly outperform the 1600.
That's what I would say. Yes.
Yeah. If it's OSC, then a mono sensor would probably outperform it.
Another big difference between the 460 and the 1600 is that the size of the chip is probably twice as big on the 1600, so you're going to get a bigger field of view. So I'm just giving a bunch of differences between the two, but as far as quality, I would say that the 460, the sensor in the 460 is better than the sensor in the 1600.
David Farina, how about combining images with images from the site from sites like SLOOH, SLOOH, and I think trying to think what specifically is the SLOOH. Is that a survey or is that just a bunch of different images? I'm not quite familiar with it, or at least it's escaping my mind what particularly it is.
It's a live broadcast thing, right? Isn't it? I'm not that familiar with it, but I think I've heard about it a couple times here.
Yeah, it must be Southern. Oh, helpful to get Southern Hemisphere. Yeah, I'm not familiar enough with it that I'd be able to comment on it. Oh, paid for subscription robotic scope. Well then, yeah. I mean, that's the same thing. Depending on what your goal is, but if you've got a high-end, good scope that, is giving you good data, then yeah, of course, use it. Find the right technique to combine it to get what you want out of it. Allows you to connect and use large telescopes to take your images for yourself. So, yeah. I mean, the way I think about it, if you got a huge telescope and it's costing you a lot of money, then get a lot of luminance on it, and then use your telescope to get the color data and combine them. Just kind of depends on what your goals are. Provides fits file for DSLR versus CCD. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a whole discussion on that.
Yeah, if you're starting out, nobody's going to convince you to spend $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 on a CCD camera. So I don't think that you're going to spend much time deliberating over whether you should buy that $3,000 camera to start out. Start with a DSLR. Buy one used modified. And honestly, you could probably get a used modified Canon. At this point, I'd say T1i or later. The XSI would be okay, or later. And hook it up to your telescope and start shooting and see if you like the routine. If you like the routine, a few months in, you've got your first few shots, get a CCD and you're going to improve your images. It's going to make calibration a lot easier. You're going to get a lot of stuff out of CCDs, but you're not going to get anything out of a CCD if you don't know how to use it and you're not having fun and you just kind of figure out that it's not for you. I started with the DSLR. I had a whole heck of a lot of fun with my DSLR, but the CCD just blows it away. It's just night and day. I wish, had I known earlier how much better the CCD images would make it, I would have done what I could to buy the CCD earlier on. Hey, it was really expensive. After I decided I wanted the CCD, and after I decided I had enough money to buy the CCD, it still took me about 1.5 years of watching Astromart to find the right deal because I wasn't quite ready to pay the retail price for the CCD. So,
And by the way, Jerry Rodriguez might have a really good argument against everything that you just said. You know, because Jerry has been known to be taking the DSLR pictures for so long. He does an extremely good job of it. We did do a show or two on CCD versus DSLR. We've done 3 or 4 actually. I know Sensor Sense Part 2 talked about that rather extensively. And that was last May, I think. So you might enjoy going back and looking at that show. I think that all of us eventually moved to, all of the people that you see at the bottom of the page here, eventually moved to CCDs because we get less noise, more control over our imaging, and less noise, and we can do more color depth and things like that than you can do with the DSLR.
I think basically when I think about the difference between a DSLR and a dedicated Astro CCD cam, I think that there are 2 primary benefits. First of all, the regulated cooling. All of a sudden, you do not have issues with calibrating darks or darks being at the wrong temperature. When I started out, every so often it would pop into my images. I'd have that walking noise with correlated noise where you'd see streaks going through your images. I don't really get that with CCDs. And the other thing is the monochromatic factor, the mono factor, which when you're shooting narrowband really helps out. It's much more sensitive in the H-alpha and you're using all of the pixels. Whereas being stuck behind the Bayer array on a DSLR is a limitation. You don't really realize how much of a limitation it is until you start shooting first narrowband, and then you see what people are getting out of narrowband with mono cameras. And David points out CCDs cut through light pollution a lot better. Maybe it comes down to the filters you're using. I'm still using, well, they're not the cheapest filters, the Baader filters. They're not said to be the best filters when it comes to light pollution, but I'll tell you, I'm on a kick right now where I'm trying to push targets that I've kind of written off as being too dim for my light polluted area, and it's basically the first time I'm coming at them with the CCD from my light polluted driveway, and I'm impressing myself. It really does pull out a lot more detail than I was expecting. I shot a H-alpha nebula with the reflection nebula in front of it. I wasn't expecting anything from it, and I got some of the blues out of the reflection nebula, and I was pretty happy with it.
Probably one of the biggest issues with DSLRs or any one-shot color camera is that the transmittance of the filters, the Bayer filters, is much lower than the transmittance of a full frame filter, right? So the Baader, Astrodons, whatever, the transmittance of those filters is significantly higher in the frequencies that we're interested in than the ones built into the chip. So you lose a lot of sensitivity with DSLRs and things like that. And even, someone mentions, I think Neil mentions CCDs with no Bayer mask. The problem with those is that you lose the micro lenses on top, right? So the sensors have micro lenses that focus the light into the photoactive area on the die, and you have to shave those off because they're actually in front of the Bayer filter, right? So you lose that effect, which drops your efficiency again. So you don't really have that much of an efficiency gain by making a DSLR Bayer free, right?
Yeah, and you have to distinguish. There are one-shot color CCDs, and there are monochromatic DSLRs. So be sure you define your terms as to what you're really after. If you're a beginner right now, I would say if you're a beginner and you can afford to go out and buy a CCD camera, then you've probably got a DSLR sitting around. So put your DSLR and start using it while you figure out how to track and figure out how to polar align and figure out how to sequence an evening and take pictures and maybe even start your processing, you know, and take some time and then figure out which CCD you're going to buy. Eventually, you'll be moving into some kind of CCD. And when we say CCD, in this case, we mean dedicated Astro camera, not particularly a CCD. By the time you get around to buying it, it may be a CMOS camera, but it's a cooled Astro camera. Okay? Again, this is all covered in a couple of presentations we've done. Sensor Sense, I know, is one topic that you can go back and look at.
Jeffrey is asking, when should an imager be seriously looking at a premium mount? What are the boxes that should be ticked to pull the trigger on such a large purchase?
Yeah, I'll throw in my 2 cents here. I think this goes to one of Alex's main points all the time: is what is money worth to you, right? So when you make that choice is really very personal, right? It's very difficult to say for an individual.
Oh, did we lose them?
I'll take over from there. I'll save you there, Dave. Yeah, we can't decide whether you drove up to this meeting today in your VW microvan or your Lexus. We don't know. But we know that there are plenty of people with the Lexus, and they drove into whatever their local store is and said, here's $10,000, make me an Astro Imager. And several years later, we were able to buy that stuff for $2,000. And I'm serious, I've done that several times. So you may not want to go out and buy brand new $10,000 mount. You might want to get into it a little slower than that and then move into the $10,000 mount, but you will want the $10,000 mount eventually. What boxes do you check? If you have gotten your camera working and you know how to communicate with the software that runs your camera and your tube, okay, and you're finding out that as good as you've gotten with tracking and guiding, that you're still seeing eccentric stars, or you're having trouble because your mount is not big enough for your tube, then it's time to invest in a better mount. Okay, but a really expensive mount is not going to change poopy processing. All right, so you don't need to jump into it. You also don't need to buy new. A 10-year-old astrophysics mount will guide better than a brand new, I'll just say XYZ mount for $2,000. Okay, even though it's 10 years old. So you can buy it used. Of course, you're not going to find that 10-year-old AP mount for $2,000 either. You know what I mean? But most of your budget should be spent on a good quality mount as soon as you decide you're serious about going into astro imaging. But I wouldn't make that decision about being serious until at least a year after getting into astro imaging. That's my take on it. David, you back yet?
Yeah, I'm back now.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you covered everything, Alex. Although Jeffrey looks like he has another point here. He's saying that he's having issues between 10 and 20-minute subs. You know, those you really have to narrow down if the problem is with the mount, right? You know, if you're having issues where it is actually guiding and worm precision and things like this, then you know, and you've got the funds lined up and everything like that, then yeah, you might consider looking at a premium mount. But you really need to make sure it's actually the mount that's limiting you, not flexure or polar alignment issues or any other number of things that can build up. You know, maybe your area is really windy, or a windshield would solve a bunch of your problems, right? You know, a lot of that stuff can build up and complicate the issue.
Jeff, if you can go 5 minutes, it seems to me that if you can go 5 minutes, or, well, 4 minutes on some wheels, 8 minutes on other worm gears, but if you can go a certain amount of time, you can go for hours, unless something else is happening. You know, once if you can get 10-minute subs out of it, the mount is not your killer.
Yeah, and he just commented, might be the side-by-side saddles going OAG next. And I was going to say,
Yeah, if you aren't OAG, there's the answer.
yeah, if you're not using an OAG, then I would definitely try an OAG before going to a mount. One way I always approach the upgrade question is, and I do this in a kind of money-centric way. When I have money burning a hole in my pocket, I say, okay, I have this much money. How can I spend this money to make my images better? What would be the best but also cheapest upgrade that'll make my images better? And it basically becomes an improvement per dollar type formula. And at some point you might say, you know, everything's going well, except my mount's not performing, or I'm tossing this many subs. I'm already using an off-axis guider, but I'm just losing all these subs. That may be the time when you go to a premium mount. That said, premium mounts are expensive. A premium mount will be your almost certainly most expensive piece of gear unless you're buying, I don't know, 10, 12, 14, 16-inch RC, in which case you need a bigger, heavier premium mount. So it's always, I don't know, it comes down to that. How much is your money worth to you? But also, what can you get? What kind of improvement per dollar would you get out of each particular thing? And I'll tell you, an off-axis guider is going to give you a whole heck of a lot of gains for the limited amount of money you have to spend on it.
Richard Wright.
Richard Wright. A lot more expensive.
Richard Wright has a standard part of his presentation that says that 80% of what you're after you'll get with the first 20% of your money that you spend, and then after that you get really diminishing returns. You know, to add that extra last few percent, you need to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So like we say, what's money worth to you? By the way, if anybody wants to see Richard in just a month now, he'll be at Nightfall. Go to nightfallstarparty.com, he said, throwing in a plug. Nightfallstarparty.com. He's out in Anza Borrego, down in Southern California, and we're going to have a wonderful star party down there, and Richard will be the prime presenter. So nightfallstarparty.com, and if you want to see Richard, we'll have a good time.
Great. I'm going to take one more question before we end the session. This is one we all like to talk about. Powering your setup in the field. Dan has 2 deep cycle batteries, but needs power to his laptop and DSLR also. So 2 deep cycle batteries, I don't know what size they are. I have a 110, 115 amp hour battery that will give me about a night powering all my gear, including my laptop. Won't give me 2 nights. But it basically, it comes down to, first of all, how much in batteries how much weight in batteries can you manage? My battery is about the max that I can carry, and when my back goes out, which just happened the other day, it makes me not want to carry it, and it makes me not want to image. So you can always break it down into 2 things. But I do, as you're mentioning, use rig runners to, or power poles to distribute the power. And I basically just on one of my battery boxes have the rig runner, and I plug my gear right into that. And I have a distribution panel that sometimes rides on top of my mount and sometimes rides on top of my battery, depending on which setup I'm using. Basically, you just have to figure out your power consumption, and you can. I ended up buying from a hobby store, Hobby King, I think it was, a power consumption meter. It's a little thing that has power poles on each end, and you can use it to determine the pull or the consumption of each individual component, and then you basically add them together, and you know how much power you're using per hour, and then you figure out based on how many hours of dark you're going to have and how lazy you want to be in the morning. Are you just going to let your mount park itself and let the cooler stay running and not worry about it until you wake up at 8 a.m.? Or are you going to walk out there at 4 or 5 a.m. when it starts to get light out just to try and conserve that power? But basically, it comes down to the power consumption of everything you're using, and you can measure it and get a better idea of it. And if you can carry, I don't know, a 60-pound battery or a 70-pound battery, then you can worry about it a lot less. If you dread carrying that 70-pound battery, then you either have to do a little bit more work or carry 2 batteries or figure out a different way to do it.
Yeah, my setup sounds similar to yours, Adam. I've got a 120 amp hour solar installation battery, and then off that I have several DC to DC converters, high efficiency converters. So they're running at 95 to 98% efficiency. So you're losing very little to the converters to get to your particular 5-volt rails or 12-volt rails or things like this, right? For mine, I also have a 15-volt rail for my mount, right? But you go through those. You're trying to get as efficient as you possibly can. I have another 20-volt rail for my laptop and things like this, so that it's all straight off the battery with as little loss as possible, and that will provide all my stuff power for a whole night and a little bit more. There's definitely some margin in there. It doesn't bring the battery level down too far, which is certainly the death of lead acid batteries if you drain them too far.
David, can you comment on running it up to 110 volt and then stepping it back to 12?
Yeah, that's so the DC to AC inverters tend to be pretty inefficient, right? So they tend to be about 80% efficiency, right? And then you have to go back through a AC to DC converter, which they can be reasonably high, somewhere around 90% sometimes, right? But you're taking 0.8 times 0.9, right? And so you're losing a quarter of your power through heat and inefficiency in the system that way, right? So
I tested this and I got overall performance was 50%.
Yeah, so it can be a lot worse depending on what equipment you're using.
And if you're using your laptop plugged into it, your laptop is actually consuming a lot of power. So it's not just that you're losing 60, 70, 80% of the power. You're actually losing a lot of power on the object that consumes most of the power. So you're using a lot more power. You're using, in overall, a lot more of the capacity of your battery.
Yeah, one of the things I do is I make sure my laptop is set up so that when you close the lid, the display turns off, but it doesn't, shut the laptop down. So that way you can close it. The display usually consumes the most power out of anything on modern laptops, right? At least for the work that we're doing. So that saves a lot of power that way. But yes, going DC to AC and AC to DC, you can lose a lot with those setups.
That is not a good idea.
Yeah.
I see some other great questions coming in. Let's cover a few more. Have you ever had a mount collision? Winston recently had the horror of coming outside in the morning and finding that his scope had collided with his mount because of a faulty USB cable. He had auto park on, but for some reason the mount disconnected and the limits for some reason were disabled. So I've actually had more than one peer collision. One of them was what sounds similar to yours, not a USB cable failure, but I parked the mount and then disconnected the mount. And I'm not quite sure, and immediately disconnected the mount before confirming that the mount parked, and I did it from inside here. And I don't know, what I think might have happened was when it was disconnected, it didn't send the signal back to the ASCOM driver and say, yes, I'm parked. So it never actually parked itself. I think it slewed to the park location, but then it continued tracking with the stars. The other peer collision that I had was a lot weirder than that. I don't quite know how this one happened, but I know one of the things I did wrong. I was not tightening my gearboxes down tight enough on my Mach 1. And one of my gearboxes actually worked itself loose and disconnected from the worm and basically just allowed the mount to slew right over. And this was in RA, and I wasn't well balanced. So when it did when it did come off of it, the mount just went with gravity and flipped itself over and seemed to clunk the camera onto the pier. Now, it was only slightly out of balance, so when I replicated it, it kind of did a graceful and didn't hit really hard. But at the same time, the astrophysics guys say balance isn't important for slewing. The mount can handle it, but balance is good for other reasons, and that's one of them. Just in case something goes wrong, it's nice to be in balance so that it doesn't have, so that it has gravity, so that gravity isn't working against it, I should say.
Or you just buy a Paramount, don't worry about pier crashes.
Or there you go. That's the one. That's Paramount guys have that on us. Because what is the? Tell us about that, Tolga. Tell us the benefit of a Paramount for a pier crash.
So the electronic system does not rely on this particular case. It doesn't rely on a computer. The electronic system built into the mount has current limit sensors. So if the current goes up for whatever reason, you can just hold on to the telescope. If it's over, too much unbalanced, or if it hits something, it will simply stop and it will just start beeping.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll take that back then, because the astrophysics mounts do the same thing. They do have that current limiting. If it does detect that the motors are slewing too hard, it immediately stalls the motor. But I'm trying to think, don't the Paramounts have some sort of way of always knowing their positioning without the absolute encoders? Or am I wrong about that?
Correct.
The homing ability.
That relies on the computer. So if you lose computer connection, if your computer decides to do an update in the middle of the night, or and you're tracking, the mount will go and track into itself. But as soon as it touches something, it will never break anything. Like I've broken things with my other mounts, like where the camera will run into the tripod leg and rip the camera off the telescope. The Paramount will stop as soon as it touches something. So that's one advantage of it.
Okay. Well, wow, we covered a lot of questions today. I think it was a really fruitful session. I kind of like these open sessions when we don't have a... and David, Tolga's asking a follow-up. He did say he had to stop his Paramount Me Too just the other day. It almost crashed the 14-inch RC into the mount. He had to power it down before it got there. But his question is, so it would have hit, but it would have immediately stopped, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
It would have stopped. In fact, try it out. Just put like a little hand pressure on your mount. Try to stop it. Put your hand on the counterweight bar and resist the speed. It will stop immediately.
Yeah, and I think if I remember correctly, when Richard Wright was on, he said lower your slew speed so that even if it does hit, it's not hitting at a high speed, and then you'll be perfectly
fine. You're talking about a crashing during a slew.
Right.
You're right. Then you can damage something if you because you have all that mass. Mm-hmm. But there is no mount in the world that's going to stop that.
Right. Well, if you do, if you have a slow slew speed, then at least it's not hitting with a bunch of force, and it will immediately cut out as soon as it detects the current.
Mm-hmm. My mount, I have my mount set up to slew at 50% of slewing speed, because I'm never. We're not even there, so who cares how long it takes to do slew from here to there? You're not talking about incredible amount of time. Some mounts advertise like 20 degrees of second or something. I don't see no benefit for that.
Great. And see, Jeffrey, I forgot it was your request for the podcast, and I'm working on that. I've actually been, well, you know, a few of the guys that watch, I've been really sick over the last 3 weeks. I'm finally better, thank goodness, because I can finally start thinking. And I hurt my back the other day, but that's getting old, I guess. Old and with kids. But yeah, I'm going to be looking into the podcasting and a few other things to improve the experience here. But I think we covered a lot of the stuff. Yeah, I like this open topic. I like the open discussions. I hope to not do one every week, but if they all turn out this way, it wouldn't bother me so much. But yeah, we are still having trouble getting people to present. So if you guys have any ideas, send me an email, drop me a line, whatever it is, and we'll try and get some fresh new stuff going on. Otherwise, we might start repeating ourselves and doing some old stuff that we just think we're getting better at.
We have to update the presentation on what makes a good astro image because, alas, Bradulina is no more.
Oh, I know. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. That's depressing. We covered a little bit of that earlier on. I am going to hold that question because Josh is the one who does narrowband tone mapping, and he would be in a better position, I think, to answer that. But maybe if I don't come up with anything midweek, we'll actually have another open session next week. And Jeff, repeating's fine. Repeating's good for two reasons. First of all, it digs the point. It digs the point home. Wow, what a malpraprism. But also because we're getting better and we know more. And some of the things we weren't quite sure on, I think we actually are getting a better hand on. So just makes sense that we repeat some stuff. But that's it. We've gone an hour and a half, a lot longer than I was expecting. So I do want to thank you all for coming, and we will see you next week. And remember, image of the week, post your things. Muddy Run Observatory, Southern Lancaster. Not too far from me. Very cool. Muddy Run, I like that title. But again, sorry for that side note. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next week.